So we will cover abortion just in a sense to give you the scope of the issue. My goal is to give you new insight and information. And then we will discuss the distinction between an established pregnancy and the beginning of life and why that's important for our discussion today. Hi, Michael.
Sorry, we were so noisy you heard your kisses.
That's okay. It would be even better if you brought a few, but that's okay.
Do you have a dog?
No. All right. So I always like starting on that etymology. All right. The word abortion actually comes from the Latin word aborrere, and that literally means to perish. All right. So if I ask you the etymology of the word abortion, not the definition, the etymology comes from the word aborrere, which means to perish. The actual definition is a simple one for us. It's the loss of a fetal life. All right? So the loss of a fetal life will be the working definition we use for abortion. Now, somebody asked the question right away in the last class, what about a miscarriage? We will talk about that in terms of a spontaneous abortion. It's not really per se the topic of our discussion today. Spontaneous abortions, a miscarriage, are always tragedies, all right? But they can be intentional. So when they're intentional, there is a moral element to it. I mean, if a woman is carrying a child for whatever reason, she has a miscarriage, obviously, if it's no fault of hers, it's just a tragedy. If they do cause it because of some particular lifestyle, or if it was intentional, like they might even throw themselves down, or they abuse their bodies through drugs or alcohol, all of those instances would have moral elements to them, even though we still would term that basically a spontaneous abortion. So we're just going to leave that to the side. That's not per se part of our discussion today. We will focus on procured abortions. These are intentional, all right? I am intentionally going to have the fetal child removed. I want to begin talking about the scope of the issue by saying this is, in Catholic social teaching, the major social justice issue. And somebody might think, why? Well, I can tell you, as a registered independent, where I sit on immigration reform, where I sit on capital punishment, where I sit on a whole host of issues, none of those get close to this in a matter of justice or in a matter of scope. This is larger in numbers than those that were killed in the African slave trade in our country, which they estimate was around 4 million, or the Holocaust in Germany, which they estimate, I guess, between 7 and 9 million. The numbers we're talking about here dwarf all of those. So it's a major social justice issue. There's no doubt. Just to give you some quick statistics, and I do want you to know that these statistics come either from the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control in the United States, or the AGI, which is the Alan Guttmacher Institute. Alan Guttmacher was a past president of Planned Parenthood, so this is not some ultra-right pro-life group that has developed statistics that make their arguments sound good. This is statistics from the other side. In 2014, there was just under 1 million procured abortions in the United States, and that, fortunately, was down. It used to hover around 1.2 million annually. So it is down. Use your calculator, that comes out to roughly 2,700 per day, or 112 unborn children per hour. So we can guess around 50 unborn children will be aborted during the fourth period here today. I want to say something real quick about oral contraception. Because typically, and what I'm trying to do is I want you to start an interior dialectic with community and politics in whatever you go into in your next life outside of school. You'll hear somebody make the argument, well, if we only had more access to contraception, we'd have less abortions. now that sounds reasonable, right? If we can put people on contraception, they're not going to get pregnant when having abortions. That will solve it. So what you guys got to do is start being for contraception. Okay, the problem is none of that is borne out in the statistics. This is from the Alan Guttmacher Institute, all right, an abortion advocate group. 51% of all women having abortions saying that they were using contraception during the month that they had an abortion. Somebody might say, well, they're not using it properly, okay? It's probably true, you know. But that, all I'm saying is, it's not that simple to say, I'll be an advocate for contraception, therefore, it'll reduce abortions. The other thing that I want to say is this. Since I was not aware that nobody talks to anybody in the school about how contraception works. I thought that would have been like a biological issue. But I guess it doesn't fall under one of their modules. So, and I don't know anything about this. So it's not a criticism. And if we get into human sexuality, I'll talk about it more in depth. But here's how it works basically, all right? The main goal of a contraception, oral contraception, is to suppress ovulation. So if there's no egg that is released, you cannot have a child conceived. The secondary way, not only say secondary, but another intended way is that it makes the vaginal cavity with the cilia hostile to sperm traveling up. So in other words, it changes the ability for the sperm to reach the egg up through the fallopian tube. Now those are probably the major ways that it works, and nobody disagrees with that. But there is a third way, all right? A third way is that it makes the endometrial wall, that's the uterine wall where the womb, it makes it hostile to implantation. So if you have breakthrough ovulation, if a woman is on oral contraception and she still ovulates, and if sperm still makes up the fallopian tube and we have fertilization, okay, at that point, if it travels back down the fallopian, not back, if it travels down the fallopian tube, it will not allow it to implant. We have a fertilized, conceived human being that will come out in menses. Now, how often does that happen? Well, let's say it this way. And again, we'll do this in much more depth if we have an opportunity later in the fourth quarter. A woman, her eggs are viable for up to 48 hours, okay, 24 to 48 hours. Sperm in the vaginal cavity can last up to 7 days. So if a person has sex in that, let's just add it together to make it simple. In that 9-day period, there's a chance for conception. By the way, it's biologically impossible to get pregnant outside of that period. Biologically impossible, all right? So part of natural family planning is for a woman to know her cycle and then to know when she is in or outside of fertility. If a woman, even a young girl, doesn't matter, if you're on contraceptions and you're sexually active and you have sex during that fertile period, they estimate 2 to 4% of the time you've had conception. Those are spontaneous abortions. But they're spontaneous abortions the individual is culpable for, because that you should have known, okay? So just something to know. We'll talk about a little bit why that's important later, all right? That was a quick 5 minutes there. I want to talk about the life of the mother. And I meant to ask a question before I brought up this screen. You don't need to write all this. I'll explain what you need to do. When you hear the life of the mother being an issue in abortion, you're hearing that she's going to die. You need to know that's not what life of the mother means, legally. Doe v. Bolton is not an obscure case. Doe v. Bolton says that the life of the mother, says right here, is medical judgments broadly based on what is appropriate in a given case, not so necessarily. Another part of it says quite plainly, the medical judgment may be exercised in the light of factors. So here's what they mean by the life of the mother. Physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age are all constituting what falls under the life of the mother. So why would I bring this up? Because if you are in a discussion about this and somebody tries to make you be some troglodyte, you're going to let the woman die, you need to know that's not what they're talking about. And what kind of makes me mad and should make you mad is a lot of politicians who make the argument are lawyers and they know better. In other words, when they're speaking, they just figure you're not bright enough to know what they're talking about. But Doe v. Bolton has really framed what the life of the mother is. So we're talking, well, I'll move on and then I'll show you a chart on why women have abortions.
Can you repeat the etymology for abortion?
I'll go back up there. Means to perish. All right. So all I'm trying to point out is if somebody says, okay, let me say this. Are there times when the woman's life is in imminent danger? Yes. And there are approaches to that from Catholic medical ethics. We don't have time to go into it today. But I also want to share with you that in the course of me teaching here, even over the last 8 or 9 years, I can think of 3 individuals who went to school here, whose their father told me that they were told unequivocally, if you don't end the life of this child, your child and mother and your wife will die. And they're fine, and all 3 of those kids graduate. All right. So we also can't always just accept that it's as absolute as sometimes it's delivered. All right. If it comes down to a choice between the 2, that gets worked out between the family. All right. Well, that's another issue that we won't handle today. All I'm trying to say is when you hear the term life of the mother, make sure you understand they are talking in these broad legal terms, not in she will die. Okay? Another hard issue is rape. Nobody is going to argue that this is a violent act against the woman. Nobody's going to argue that. All right? What's the Catholic Church's approach to a woman who's been raped? Okay? First of all, and you don't I should have talked to you about the moral act first, or would have made this more sense. If a woman has been raped, there are tests you can do to determine whether or not she has ovulated. If she has not ovulated, even a Catholic hospital will administer emergency contraception. Now, somebody might say, I thought the church was against contraception. See, tomorrow you'll learn what a moral object is. The whole moral object changes. What is happening there is not contraception. What is happening there is she's repelling the attacker, and the sperm is an extension of the attacker. So even we've had cases where nuns who were sent to missionary areas where there was a high likelihood of rape were given emergency contraception have they been raped, because they are allowed to defend themselves against an attacker. Now, if ovulation has occurred, the Catholic ethic says you can do nothing. Because why? Because at that point we have a new human being. Yeah, but she's been raped. We understand that's a violent act. Why should she have to carry that? It's a human being. You know, at some point we have to lay it out and say we cannot take another life in this instance. All right. Now, whether people like that scenario or not, that's a little more nuanced than you probably would hear out in the political world. Okay. The last category is incest. You always hear, what about the life of the mother, rape or incest, right? I'm going to offer to you that that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. It has 0. Somebody might say, oh, so if an older person gets rapes a younger person and gets them pregnant, then that doesn't count? If it's non-consensual sex is rape, okay? It's already covered here. Consensual incest is a different story. And before you think, well, who would have consensual incest? Plenty. If we get into human sexuality, I'll show you. They're advocating for the rights to have it legalized and even be married. Now, if that kind of doesn't sit well with you, well, let me tell you what they are saying. Why can't 2 people love each other? They're using the same exact language, right? So if it's sort of like a knee-jerk yuck reaction, I can assure you that 30 years ago that was the same reaction to homosexual relations, all right? All I'm trying to say is if it's non-consensual incest, it's already covered under rape. If it's consensual, it has nothing to do with this issue. I don't think that should even be brought up. Why is it brought up? Because it poisons the well. They're going to force somebody into a situation where you have to defend incestual relationships. But you don't. It just takes a couple sentences to clear the whole thing up. Now, these are hard cases. So let's just say this. Let's say that we have a politician who is against abortion, but he's being told he's some right-wing extremist. He won't even allow it in cases of life of the mother, rape, or incest. What if he capitulated? Or she capitulated and said, you know what? I'll allow it in those hard cases. Do you think that would solve the issue? No. It's not really about these hard cases. And I think people have to start being intellectually honest with themselves. Here's from the Alan Guttmacher Institute. This is the research they've done. 74% say having a baby would interfere with their work, school, or other responsibilities. Really? So now we're talking about ending a child because of some either career path or it's going to be a burden at home. That's not quite the same. See, if we gave in on all these hard cases, let's not pretend that ends it. You know, so what I say, what dialectic does is dialectic forces them into an argument at the base of where they're at. So if you want to argue that a person should be able to have an abortion for any reason, which some people advocate, because they don't need a good reason, okay, let's argue that then. And let's not bring up these hard cases because it's not really about those. Obviously these statistics overlap. 73% say they can't afford a child. Well, I don't know what that means. I was not able to afford any of my children. I can't afford them now. I'm one paycheck away from going under. So what does it matter? Okay? And I'm not fading away. 48% say they don't want to be a single parent or have relationships with either their husband or their partner. You know, I'm not being crass here, but you know, maybe you should have thought about that before you caved into your instincts. See, the Catholic Church, again, has a higher instance of the human person. We believe that your rationality can overcome your instincts. We're not animals. Why can't we talk about that in a different issue? Less than 2% say they became pregnant as a result of rape or incest. Let's just say abortion is used to save the life of the mother. I don't know what the statistic is, but let's say it's another 2%. Let's say that it's 4%. If we got rid of selfish reasons and just kept to the hard cases and seriously the physical life of the mother, we'd be down to 4%. That would be a heck of a jump. So all I'm trying to say is the scope of the issue. Understand what surrounds this. Because this often gets peripheral. You'll even see language changing, right? You rarely see people who are pro-abortion. Does anybody know what the whole thing falls under now? What do they say? What rights?
Pro-choice.
Well, pro-choice was the next one. It was pro-abortion, then it became pro-choice. Now it's reproductive rights. I mean, the argument's going this way. Why? Because between science and reason, it's getting lost here. Okay? Catholic Church issued a document called the Declaration on Procured Abortion. Two things I want you to know about it. One is, the right to life is a fundamental right. It's that simple. The right to life is a fundamental right. Let me reiterate. Regardless of my positions on opening up immigration policies, or gun control, or getting rid of capital punishment. We could talk about all those things, but none of those things make any sense until you can secure a person's life. Think in these terms. You're home alone with your mother. Somebody breaks in your house with a shotgun and points it at you. What's the first thing you negotiate? For the china? Don't kill me. Why? Because if they're going to kill you, what the heck is anything else in the house have any meaning? And you're not even done with that, right? You work through a whole hierarchy of goods. If you negotiated with this, like you're a good up and rising lawyer, right? You negotiated and they promise we will not kill you. You're not done. Now you're going to say, don't hurt me, don't maim me, don't injure me. And if they agree not to hurt, maim, or injure you, you're still not done. They're going to say, well, don't terrorize me, don't psychologically, ruin me. And if you can negotiate that, now you start with the important things in your house. So you would lay out a hierarchy of goods. That's all we need to do here. But the top one is life. So if we have, let's just use immigration. If we have people that are not seeing these individuals as human persons, maybe it ought to start with understanding what life is and what a human person is. Let's start there, and then maybe that'll work too. The other one is recognition does not constitute the right. What does that mean? The right does not exist because somebody recognized it. We say that so in our Constitution, right? These truths, Inalienable rights. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Life being chief among them. All right? So they don't, it's not a matter of whether or not anybody recognizes them. It's fundamental and it's inalienable. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay, you guys always make it easy. All right, so now what I want to talk about is the beginning of life. Early in history, it was thought that life began in quickening. Anybody ever hear that word before? Quickening? It's just quick, E-N-ing, all right? That's when the baby moved. So anybody that's known anybody that's pregnant, everybody wants to feel when the baby's kicking, you know, that type of thing. So early in history, it was thought that life began at quickening. This may seem archaic to us, but you're going to see just how novel it is that we understand differently. They thought, some, not all, they thought that the man contained the semen. By the word semen comes from the Latin word just for seed. So the man was the seed, and the woman was the fertile ground. So the man was the seed, and the woman was the fertile ground. Now, that, again, that sounds like archaic to us, because we know about modern biology, but if you're an agrarian culture, you knew how things worked. There was a seed that contained everything necessary for the functioning of the plant, and then there was fertile ground that nurtured it. So they figured that's how it worked with man and woman, all right? St. Augustine believed the soul is infused at that point around 18 to 22 weeks because they felt the child move. Let me tell you up front why I'm doing this. People will say, and they have said to me, the church has changed its position on abortion. And I say, how so? Well, they used to not have a problem with abortion before 22 weeks. Now they do. Okay, it's not true. What they don't understand, what's the argument behind it. So I'm laying some groundwork to explain that to you. All right? See, here's why they thought this. The Latin word for soul is anima. It's where we get the word animate. So they thought, well, the father has the seed. He nurtures it in the woman's womb. At some point, God infuses the soul, and when that happens, the baby animates. At that point, it becomes a human person. Because before that, there was no soul. You can't be a person without an embodied soul. This is why dead people are not persons. There's no soul, all right? At that point, we have a body. So they just thought beforehand, you just have a developing organism with no soul, all right? Now, by the way, when life begins was never a theological issue. But they were still trying to work it out. What they said was, aborting an unborn person, once they realized it was animated, it was always thought to be a mortal sin. Never, ever was that a discussion. I can show you documents from 70 AD. 70 AD, before some of the books in the Bible were written that say abortion is murder. All right, so we're not changing our idea of abortion and murder. What's changing here is when life began. So I want to just point out that the church teaching was consistent on two things. The church teaching was consistent that killing an unborn person was an abortion. Church teaching was consistent that killing an unborn person was an abortion. And the second thing is that abortion was a grave sin. So they were consistent. One, that killing an unborn person was an abortion. And two, that abortion was a grave sin. It was murder. That's never changed. For somebody to say that they changed their position on abortion, they haven't. What's changed is their understanding of when life began. But that was based on bad biology. All right? So we have the advent of modern biology. Just a couple little interesting facts. You should already know, let me channel Miss Buchanan here, when two haploid cells merge, after that, you have new genetic material, okay? You guys know what gametes are, right? So we have new gametic material. This is genetic material that is unique from the mother and the father. That's what happens when two haploid cells unite. That's conception, okay? You don't need to know what the development was. Just know that around the 17th and 18th centuries, they started to think there was more to this. They started to study spermatozoa. They started to know that there must be other gametes that are coming together. They didn't understand the process, but they were getting past the fact that the man contained the whole seed and the woman's womb was simply the fertile ground, okay? They were starting to move beyond all that. Look when they actually understood how it worked. 1876, we're talking about 150 years ago. A guy was studying sea urchins. And it was the first time that fertilization of the nuclei was observed under a microscope, right? Fertilization of the nuclei was observed under the microscope. If you look at the drawings he did, even modern biology says how remarkably close they were. I mean, this guy hit it. So it wasn't until this point, and we're almost into the 1900s here, where they really understood this is when life begins. So all they did was take their principles that life begins at animation, but now we understand that animation is the beginning of ensoulment. It goes back to fertilization. All right? You get that? Yes.
What was the first one?
Life begins when two haploid cells merge. After that, you have new genetic material. Absolutely unique genetic material. Which, by the way, is not part of the woman. So when somebody says the baby's part of the woman, that's another bad understanding of biology. Okay? And this is stuff I'm no doubt Ms. Buchanan would reinforce. So here's our issue. We have this ongoing discussion now. It's semantics. Anybody know what semantics is? It's a play on words. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Nuances.
Yeah, nuances of the language, right? Do we really determine when life begins at pregnancy, or do we do it at conception? Life begins at fertilization. Typically, we refer to that as conception. All right? So when Mary conceived through the Holy Spirit, the baby Jesus, at that moment, we would say there was fertilization, there was conception. Implantation is a different term. Implantation is when the fertilized embryo, and I think by common in plants it's called a blastocyst, it actually attaches to the uterine wall, and that could be, 6 to 8 days later. All right, so a woman actually has a new life within her, absolute unique genetic material. That embryo travels down a fallopian tube over the course of 5 to 7 days, implants on the uterine wall. Now they call that a pregnancy. Okay. So we have two terms. We have beginning of life and pregnancy. This, you don't need to write it down. You just simply need to know. Not every moment of fertilization results in an implantation. They say medically roughly a third to a half of all fertilizations wind up being spontaneous abortions. Now the only reason I bring that up is I've seen moral theologians and philosophers argue, why doesn't the Catholic Church make a big stink about that? I don't even understand the argument. What are we supposed to do? It's just a tragedy of nature. But you believe life begins at conception, yes. Well then, that's murder. How could, it's not murder. The woman had nothing to do with it. I mean, unless there was, some culpability because of how she was carrying her health. Otherwise, it's just a miscarriage, a spontaneous abortion. So it's really a non-issue. Don't worry about any of this stuff. It just reiterates everything I just said. All right? It talks about there's a short window in there in which an egg can be fertilized. Right? So there's only, really, the egg's viable for 2 days, tops. Right? If fertilization does not occur in that time, the egg dissolves, and then hormonal changes trigger menstruation, and so on. All right? So they talk about a pregnancy is considered to be established only after implantation. All right? So that's from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So we know that. We have no issues with that. But there's ethical questions that arise, okay? We have to ask ourselves, which one of these are ethical dilemmas for us? Is it an ethical dilemma when the pregnancy is established? No. The ethical dilemma is when life begins. So, did I already talk to you about how they removed Yeah, see, when you do this again, time after time you forget what you said and didn't say. They removed the warning of abortifacient from oral contraceptions. All right. Here's the issue, and this is why you see semantic language play going on. On oral contraception, it was listed that abortifacient was one of the side effects, which meant that you were having a spontaneous abortion. Well, pro-life groups were seizing on that, and that was an issue. In other words, I got to share with you, so I have a little bit of time. You know, I live in one of these Bermuda triangles of traveling missionaries. So I get the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Baptists, and they all show up at my house. And you know, my family's so tired of talking about this stuff. I figure this is like having friends over to play. You know, so I always invite them in, and we have good civil discussions. Well, the one time I had a Jehovah's Witness couple come to me. Now they are okay with contraception, but they are absolutely against abortion. But they literally walked in my house, and I invited them in. And usually my kids scurry off to their bedrooms, so they don't have to listen. And they saw my Sacred Heart of Jesus picture. They saw my wife's son, Damiano, cross, and they said, "Are you Catholic?" I said, "I am. I'm Roman Catholic." They said, "Would you mind talking about a controversial topic?" "No, not whatsoever." "So what would you like to talk about?" They said, "Well, you might not be prepared to discuss it. We'd like to talk to you about contraception." You know, this is my field. I'm literally thinking, there's a hidden camera somewhere. This is like too good. We sat down for an hour and a half. I gave them stuff to read. They came back the next Saturday, sat down for another hour and a half, sent me an email. They said, "We're rethinking the whole business." I mean, what happened was people were understanding that if they were on, okay, if a woman can only become pregnant for 7 to 9 days, let's say 9 days, right? Outside of those 9 days, it is biologically impossible for a woman to become pregnant. So if you are sexually active on contraception, during that fertile period, there's a 2 to 4% chance that you've had breakthrough ovulation and that you've had a spontaneous miscarriage, which you are responsible for. That was enough for them. And the irony is, and I've been teaching this for 15 years, I have never had one person ever say I've changed their mind, except those 2 Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, that's kind of ironic, because they understood what was at stake, all right? So what they did is they removed the warning. Why could they remove the warning? Because what it says now is that contraception does not end in established pregnancy. Well, yeah, it never ended in established pregnancy. Once that, you know, blastocyst is embedded into the wall of the uterine, contraception is not going to be able to dislodge it. But our ethical issue is when life begins, which is about 7 to 8 days prior to that. All right? Totally different issue for us. Let me just say this, by the way, because when we get into moral object, you'll understand this. A lot of young women might be on what is termed birth control for other reasons. Heavy bleeding, mood disorders, cysts that are forming, acne, although that's a little bit of a stretch, all right? If you have really, really bad acne, fine. If you're on it, you're not on contraception. You're on a medical treatment of hormones, okay? I understand the OBGYN, they're going to say, "I'll put you on birth control." You're not. You're on hormone treatment. Now, if you say, "Well, I'm on it, I can't get pregnant, I might as well have sex," okay, now you're on contraception. And the object changes. And tomorrow I'll explain how you understand a moral object. So, you don't need to write this down. This is FYI, but I'm going to make a point, so let's not start ruffling our papers and getting ready. If we are not going to say that life begins at conception, and if we're not going to say it's a human person until some later point, you have to be intellectually honest with yourself and say, when is that? You have to. Unless you're apathetic. And if you're apathetic, then you should just get out of the whole business of having a discussion about it. So when does this young, unborn individual become a person? Is it when their heart beats? 10, 12 weeks? When they sense pain? 20 weeks? Think of the abortions that are after that. That's one of the arguments. These children feel the pain of the slicing just like an adult would. At quickening, typically happens 20 to 25 weeks, but by your second and third children, you're feeling movement by 13 weeks. So is that the marker? You know? Or viability, you know, because if a child, it makes it to 22 weeks, typically that child can exist outside of the womb because we have enough care now. If that's your marker, what do you do when this keeps getting lowered? Like if some people say, I'm against abortion after viability, that's kind of a weird argument, because that's a moving target. It's dropping. And in the next 15 to 20 years, you guys are going to see artificial wombs. You will. And once you have an artificial womb, that argument's gone. All right? Which, by the way, this was Roe v. Wade. Okay? Abortion's up to viability. It was Bolton. It was that one that extended it because of the life of the mother. Okay? Or is it when the child's born roughly around 40 weeks? And if you still don't think that, if you think it's some developmental stage, like say self-awareness, that's only 5 months after they're born. So as I told you, some moral philosophers advocate that you can end a child's life up to that point, because at that point they're still not self-aware, because they think this is birth, 40 weeks is the most ridiculous marker. Well, I agree. But here's what I want you to think about. Let's just say that you say it's viability. It's when they can live on their own. You're going to have to apply this to people who are out in the world. If they fall below that category, do they lose their personhood? If it's only when they are animated, they have a beating heart, they can feel pain and they're moving, I don't think they're a human person till they're viable, so I don't include any of that. What do we do with people who are in permanent states of coma or on life support that respond to stimuli but really are not viable on their own? Do they lose their personhood? You have to be intellectually consistent throughout, okay? That's my whole point. Anything? All right.